Okay, anyway. That's the way I'm just going to start all the videos from now. So for tonight, we're in 1 Corinthians 2, just going through the chapter. When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with the demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age, who are coming to nothing. No, we speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it is written, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him. But God has revealed it to us by His Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God, for who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the man's spirit within him? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. We have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them, because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual man makes judgments about all things, but he himself is not subject to any man's judgment. For who has known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. So, a lot of what I was being given with this message tonight, in this chapter, was the point that as human beings, we are reactive creatures. We react to the things that affect us throughout in the world. Whether pain is a fine example, which we were talking about earlier here. But there are so many other things. We crave love, we crave satisfaction, we crave place, we crave meaning, we crave value. We run from fear, pain, doubt, all the different things that crop up that would affect us negatively, we push away from, and we thirst after the things that affect us positively. And one of the most difficult things that we run into as human beings in general is that sometimes we don't understand what's happening, what God's doing around us. And the thing of it is when Paul shares this point about the man without the Spirit of God and things being foolishness to him, there are a lot of things that we might receive from God or find in response to God that we ultimately will reject because it goes against that way that we function. Our reactions are to push this way as opposed to that way, because our perception tells us that this is the right way to go, when God's telling us to go against that grain. And see, one of the grand difficulties that we have to face is that, and this is one of those big things about why we have to be willing to submit our will to God, is that when we're not subject to Him, we don't understand Him. We don't understand why He's doing the things that He's doing. Sometimes He'll tell us to go places or to be places or to do things that are going to run the risk of being uncomfortable. And this is to use a grave understatement. And the thing that's hard about that is that we worry about the fight, we worry about the contention, we worry about the pain, we worry about the rejection, we worry about all the different things that could go wrong, because that's what we feel to do. What we don't do is perceive that God has a plan in this, that he's doing something with this. We don't perceive through his Spirit. I would argue that the vast majority of Christians don't really know God. And I don't think that anybody's going to debate me on that. Because the reality of it is that we don't. Most of us are like little kids with him. And as he's giving us direction or he's trying to get us to eat our vegetables. And we're screaming and fighting because we don't like the taste of the vegetables. We don't understand that the nutrients are important for our developing bodies. We don't understand or care about that. We don't understand that that if we just continue eating candy, we're going to make ourselves sick, because candy tastes great. Right. We don't see the long view in any way, shape, or form. We're not thinking about our future. We're not thinking about the things that God has already seen. So we end up kicking and screaming. But see, the hard part about this is, like, this analogy's funny because it brings it down to this level that almost makes the whole thing seem foolish. But if we're going to be real for a moment, the things that we end up dealing with God end up being things that aren't childish. They aren't foolish. It's not cute. They're hard things, like relationships. God telling you not to be in a relationship with that woman or that man. And you doing it anyways. And then you find yourself trapped in this thing. God told you right from the beginning not to do it, but it felt good. So you chose to go with it. You chose to stay there. You chose to live in that. You chose to be there. And then now it hurts because it's gone. Whether it's broken now or it was years of brokenness, or it doesn't matter, because the truth of it is that you went through hell. And now you have to pick up the pieces. And it hurts to go back and pick up those pieces because there's a lot of pain there. There's a lot of stuff that's really, really difficult to look at, to live through again. But in order to receive the healing that we need, we have to. But it doesn't feel good, so we don't want to do it. We run from it. We grab at anything that can feel better. And this is the thing where that analogy stops being cute. Like, we're looking for candy when we need to eat our vegetables. The problem is our vegetables, in this case, are deep-seated, painful memories of things that traumatize us or made us feel like less than we are. Where God has to bring us face to face with that false identity and then shatter it in order for us to understand who we actually are in Him. So that we can finally stop beating ourselves down with the lies that we were told by hateful people. So that we can see ourselves through His eyes for the first time ever. Really, truly, for the first time ever. But it doesn't feel good, so we don't want to do it. When God tells you not to take that job and you're in desperate need of the job, and you know He's telling you not to do it, but you need it. I mean, granted, your bills are taken care of, everything's being taken care of, but you really, 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 really need this. Or you just really, really want it because it's a really cool job. God's telling you no. It ends up being the same deal. See, the thing of it is that where it correlates to us and God is that He's seeing a future for us and a person in us that we don't have any convention to receive. See, oftentimes when we come to him, we're already carrying the scars of life in this world and everything that that looks like. It's painful, it's gross. And sometimes we're just naive. Sometimes we think we have an idea. People who grow up in church, it's funny because they're not that different. See, the people who don't grow up in church have no idea who God is, but at least they can admit that. People who grow up in church oftentimes think they have an idea of who God is. But the problem is that a lot of that viewpoint of him is manufactured either through what they were ingrained with through the process of being taught through Sunday school and so on. We all know that all Sunday school teachers have an incredible grasp on the Holy Spirit.
Some do.
It's a small number. But that's the thing, is like, we end up looking at stories. So just to give an example to flesh that out, rather than that seeming like a pure judgment on Sunday school teachers. A lot of Sunday school teachers focus on stories because that's what you're taught to do. So they focus on stories like the story of Samson, the story of David killing Goliath, the story of Moses parting the Red Sea. We grow up with these stories about these great biblical individuals. Which components of the gospel do you think are best translated through those stories? There are some, but it takes effort to get there. The reason why they're told to give those stories in particular is because that's what keeps the kids' attention. And that is ultimately what the desire is. It's not to teach them about the Bible per se, it's to keep their attention. And in that they miss the point. So this isn't like a pure judgment thing, this is just a reality of what Sunday school curriculum, and the realities of what church oftentimes does look like. Even a lot of messages, once you get past that and you go look at churches, and the way that some pastors speak, they're just trying to grab your attention. The idea, it's an evangelistic mindset of we're going to get your attention, and then we're going to bring you to a place where maybe you can receive Jesus, and then once you receive Jesus, you'll change. That removes any of the process and things like that. It's commonplace Bible school.
Oh no, I know. I'm just
Yeah.
like, that's not how it's supposed to work.
Agreed.
Where's the discipleship there?
Right. And that's a big thing. That's a huge, huge thing. So in this whole thing where Paul's talking about this mind, having this mind of Christ, what we end up having to look at is this question of where is this in the church and in us? And then are we really even being are we even really being open and being willing to submit to that? Because there's a lot of component to what God sees that we don't. There's a lot of God's character that we don't understand. I grew up reading the story of Samson and Delilah. Like, that was always the favorite story. That was the go-to. I also liked Jonah and the whale. I also liked Job as a kid. Not Job's suffering, but the part about the Leviathan and the behemoth I thought was super cool.
That makes sense.
So I would
know there's probably a crocodile in it though. But
whatever. I didn't care. Even if that was the case, that was awesome because they mentioned a crocodile in the Bible, and that's all that I cared about. I was like 5. But that was the thing, like when we talk about Jesus' character and even receiving the Holy Spirit, those stories don't give a very good segue for a child to understand what that is or to grow in that. And then growing up, you end up developing ideas, and especially when like the teachers that you have are people that don't understand it themselves. They don't have grace. So they look at the story of Samson destroying the entire temple of Philistines, and they're just like, that's what God does to his enemies, kids. And then they present this idea and project and even propel forward this point that God's pure interest is in destroying, by murdering.
My sister was babysitting a couple little kids, and was playing like Veggie Tales of that very scenario.
Yeah.
And when Samson was like tearing down the pillars and all the people were running and screaming, she said that the two little kids' facial expressions were like, no, oh, what's happening? Like,
Yeah.
freaked out.
Yeah.
Like they were probably screaming and running.
Yeah. And like there was a time and a place and a precedence for that. However, that's not the heart of God. He didn't look at this and say, I want to kill all these people. Ultimately, it came down to a circumstance where there wasn't a lot of other options. And Samson was pushing on the pillars. So as such, we carry these ideas where we don't really know who God is. And see, earlier when we were talking, that point you made about pressing into him is incredibly important. Because see, in this place of pressing into him, that's where we receive all this stuff that Paul's talking about. Like you can't learn who God is purely from hearing it from other people. They can help, sure. Sometimes they can hinder. And that's kind of like the...
Sometimes.
That's kind of like the 50-50 split there. Is like they're either going to help you or hinder you because they're going to either teach you who God is or they're not. It's why it ends up being so extremely important that we all have our own relationships with God. That we are taking that time, pressing into him, learning from him, receiving from him, from his Spirit. Because we all have that. In this room, you are all people who hear from God in some way or another. And what I mean by that is that you have his Spirit with you. There are ways he's able to get through to you. And even if you're not aware of that, you just ask for things. Ask for ways for him to speak to you. Sometimes he'll send other people. Sometimes he'll give you dreams. Sometimes it'll be any number of different things. We got a bunch of prophets in the room. If they get a word for you, it's probably something real. And something that's going to be for you. And you can ask for that stuff. All of that in order to foster this relationship with God. That where you can learn who he is and even understand him, and in doing so, understand who you are. And one of the biggest things in this, and one of the biggest words that I kept hearing over and over again being brought back was, in all of this, was to be real and to be honest about who you are and where you're at. Because the thing of it is that in all of this stuff where Paul's talking about how he showed up to just show them God, there's a lot of human wisdom that says that we need to do certain things in order to be examples of Jesus. And even if it's true for somebody to say, well, if you're not exhibiting these components of, or these gifts of the Spirit, as it were, the fruit of the Spirit, sorry. If you're not exemplifying these fruit of the Spirit, then you're not really illustrating Jesus. There's a truth to that, but the way that that's presented is in such a way where it's not about it's not about who you are, but it's what you're doing. And it becomes a focus, and then in our minds, oftentimes we take that as, oh, well, I need to go do this now. And therein lies the problem, is that then we try to take control of this, and when we try to take control of it, we will ultimately end up faltering because it actually removes God from the situation. Because instead it becomes us changing ourselves instead of God changing us. And see, that's the part where this reality thing comes in, is that we can't grow and change in God if we're just trying to pretend like we're different. See, one of the biggest things is that earlier I was reading to Heather and David a message that I wrote about depression about a year ago. It was back in last April. And about the reality of having that and what that feels like, what that's like, it's a combination of things. And the thing of it was that in that, the only way for me to grow past that, something that I learned very early on when God actually had to like work with me through it, was for me to allow him to work with me through that. If depression, as an example, is a collection of a lot of different things working together at one time to destroy you, it ultimately ends up being God who's going to unravel all those little things to pull it apart. And that's the thing. However, with depression, what a lot of people do is they try to take control of it themselves. Because it feels bad, and we want to feel good. So we self-medicate. One thing I had to talk to a friend of mine about, because she was suffering depression as well, was she was doing this thing where she was trying to control her depression by focusing on things that she was happy about. So every day, she would take and grab onto something that made her happy or she was thankful about, and try to force herself out of that depressed mindset by focusing on that. Some days this worked. Most days it didn't, because the reality was the feelings of despair and depression were still there. The hopelessness and the gravity of that still remained. All that she did was put on a fake smile and cover it up and say, I'm really thankful for this. That doesn't actually change your state. And the trouble with it is that anybody who's had depression knows how that works. Anybody who's had anxiety knows that when somebody says, just stop being anxious, that doesn't actually change anything. You can try to focus on things to change it. It doesn't change it. It's not about fortitude. When you have a disorder, you have a disorder for a reason. It's not simply a negative, it's not simply that you feel negatively and you just need to turn that frown upside down. It's that there's a real thing going on inside of your psyche.
Kind of like that, like what comes to mind is it's very similar to that thorn that Paul had.
Yeah.
Like there is something that you're needing to pay attention to address with God to fix before it starts going away.
Yeah. And that's the thing of it, is like even with that, with each of those examples, and that's not to say that we shouldn't like take those to God or anything like that. That's certainly not to remove the hope of that. On the contrary, there's a place for us to let God move in those things. But sometimes we have to be willing to accept that that's not always going to look the way that we want it to look or that we think it should look.
Things rarely do.
Right. Sometimes for example, when God healed me from depression, the first time around, before working in the church for years, the first time that he did that, part of the way he did it was by addressing different things that really, really hurt. Stuff with my family, stuff with who I thought I was, stuff with who I thought he was, stuff that I believed about our relationship to one another, like what he thought of me versus how he actually did. Just to like clarify that, because it's vague, is that I was raised under the concept that God doesn't need you or care about you so much. Like he loves you, but love is not really the word for it. It's really more that he appreciates you, and that your place is always beneath him.
Thanks for bringing that casserole. We really appreciate it.
Exactly. Whereas what he did to address that specifically was to take me to Revelations 3:21, where Jesus is saying to one of the churches in the end times that for them who overcome, he'll give them the right to sit with him on his throne, just as his Father gave him the right to sit with him on his throne. And what that spoke to me was the reality of almost an element of equality that God calls us into through Jesus. And that was something that I had not grown up with. I did not understand that. So having to face that idea, I had always believed that, you know, God effectively just wanted automatons or something like that. There were parts where I believed that. And even though
Calvinism?
sure, I kind of scoff at it now, but this is what I was believed.
What is that?
Automatons?
Yeah.
Like mindless slaves, basically, like robots.
Okay.
Like unthinking, but acting and completely beholden to a superior power or
So-
program.
Like.
So-
Just cause a
Calvinism.
programmer and you're an algorithm that's being run by a program.
Right.
Okay.
So I had that mindset, and it wasn't, and God had to break me out of that. He had to show me something specific to break me out of that and show exactly how much value he had for me. That was one step in getting over my depression. The stuff with my family was much harder. Those constant places of betrayal with family and friends and loved ones of all kinds, and having to retread that old ground and look at it and let God point it out so that I could forgive, that was a heck of a lot harder. And that wasn't fun. That wasn't enjoyable. That was painful. It was painful to feel all those feelings again. It was painful to feel that anger again. It was painful to look at everything that had happened again.
But totally necessary.
Absolutely. And even in that, where I was able to forgive them was where he was able to bring me to a place and heal me.
It's often said that forgiveness is not for the other person, it's for you.
Right.
Like, the other person couldn't care less, most times.
Most times, that's true.
But for you, if you don't forgive them, it is going to destroy you from the
Yeah.
inside out. And it's not going to take long.
Yeah. There's that old, who was the poet who wrote The Poison Tree?
William Blake.
William Blake.
I love that one.
Yeah.
I never heard that one.
William Blake's Poison Tree. It basically talks about vengeance or is it wrath, specifically. But it talks about how the poison in it just moves
Destroys
through
you.
the person, destroys the person. You hold that wrath ready for the other person, and it kills you in the process.
And even if you get your vengeance or your wrath fulfilled, it's never really fulfilled. It's never enough. Kind of like Batman, really.
Yeah.
Like, he's never done, he's never satisfied, it's never enough.
Yeah.
That quote that's attributed to Buddha that says, holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for it to kill the other person.
That is exactly what it is. And you could replace resentment with unforgiveness or bitterness or wrath or
Mhm.
any of those.
Yeah. And to pull this back into place here, those are all things that God will take us to and even ask us to give up. And to be real about it, as twisted as it is, there are times where it feels good. It feels better in our hearts and souls, in our minds, to be bitter at somebody and to hold that resentment than it does to let it go.
Temporarily.
It doesn't matter.
It's like someone in hell that
Because-
hates God might feel a sense of ennoblement and just cling on to that.
For the person involved, they're not looking at it in a temporary thing. They're not looking at how it's going to affect them. Again, we go back to that kid analogy. They don't care about the candy, about the vegetables being good for them. What they care about is how it feels. This tastes sweet in a twisted way, so they're going to hold on to it.
Yeah.
That's kind of
It's like the candy is poisoned.
Right.
that thing like I was talking about earlier,
Dark
like that
romance,
thought
too.
that I had. Like sometimes you can like kind of find like a peace about things, like when you realize how God had worked out something that could have been like just super terrible had you just like went with it. But in actuality, like you could turn any unforgiveness or bitterness, like you're like, oh my gosh, like that person is like super unaware, like you know, that situation was just a crap situation, but God, like, used it for good. Like, he really did turn it around. And then you're like, that is so amazing that he would, like, do that for me. Like, that he could, like, change the whole course for me. And then it turns into, like, I'm not gonna say it's like a happiness, but it's like a kind of relief thing. You're like, wow, this is kind of cool, because then you're able to, like, absorb that, all that, like, crappy stuff, and just be like, it's like null and void anymore.
Yeah. So, in all of those things, like bringing that all up, and even looking at some of the little parts there, we come back to this point about the mind of God and what He's doing with us. And see, it's important for us to be willing to surrender ourselves to Him so that we can even receive that. So we can even receive the understanding that He has about what He's trying to do. We can't do that if we're running from Him. And that's not just in the sense of I use the term running, but the reality is that can look anywhere from just like distracting ourselves with our phones to literally leaving the church and running away from any form of community, refusing to pray, all those kinds of things. There's a big breadth of different ways in which we can run from God. And that ends up being a really important thing, what you're saying about Him working all things out for good, is that for God Himself, He's going to continue to try to bring you back to Him, and to heal you, and to bring you back into the fullness of relationship with Him. And that can't happen if you're not present, and it can't happen if you're not honest. We need to be aware of Him and present with Him in order to receive this mind, this Spirit, in order to learn who He is. Because as stated by Paul so well, who can know God's mind except, without His Spirit? But He gives that to us. As Paul talks about in the earlier part of the chapter, where they were sharing the message that they shared through the Spirit, and how Paul was coming with the Spirit of God, as opposed to any stories or any human wisdom. Paul was effectively removing himself from the situation in order to bring God to these people, because that was the way that God would want it. He wants to be known. And see, we fall into this really risky place of grabbing onto these old idioms that humans hold on to, these old ideas and wise statements, and even those can be blinding. Which is why it's important to be in step with God, with any kind of message or whatever, or teaching, where you're trying to help people to learn who God is. I mean, to give an example, or sort of to bring it some clarity here, if you want to know Dusty, what is the best way to know Dusty?
Talk to her.
To talk to her.
By buying her a drink.
To buy her a drink and talk to her. As opposed to asking Jeremy what he's heard about her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or especially asking, some obscure stranger what they've heard about Dusty.
She must be on television then.
This is the thing. This is the thing that we oftentimes do with God.
It's like going through a back channel and almost trespassing sometimes when you could just get, at least with certain personal information.
Or hopping on her Facebook wall and trying to determine her person from that. Good luck.
Good luck.
Especially when you go to like down the line.
Right?
Dude.
Yeah. But that ends up being...
That and the fact that she's almost never on Facebook anymore.
The photo tells everything.
She doesn't post a lot.
Yeah, she doesn't post much.
I'm just
Ever.
angry about
What you
everything.
don't say
All the
also
time I
says
crush
all that.
skulls.
But see, in all of that, that's the point here. Is that in order to know God, we have to be close to Him. Just like any person, in that sense. The other part is the honesty part. If we're not honest about where we are, even in our feelings, and I know that this aspect's a little bit shoehorned in because it's not totally addressed here in this passage, but it's what I was given to talk about, so we're talking about it. And it correlates to what we're talking about, so we're doing it.
I like this.
This part about being honest with ourselves and with God. We've talked about this before in the past with this point that, God already knows. You can't fake Him out, you can't lie to Him. But you can really lie to yourself, and that's something that human beings are notedly good at. And even those those old idioms from human wisdom, we can use those incredibly well to do that even better because they kind of work, sort of, in a way. We're told to, we grab onto things that our experience tells us are true. Time-tested statements that we hold on to and we maintain because they're proven. Even like something as, I don't know, I can't think of a really good one right now. The only one that I can that I can think of is like a penny saved and is a penny earned. And I guess the idea is the assumption then that because you saved a penny, you're going to get something out of that that's going to actually benefit you, and that's not necessarily always true. You just end up with a jar full of pennies and then nobody will accept them because it's just really tedious to deal with it. But see, the reality is that those kinds of idioms, time-tested, illustrated things, they can separate us from God because they become things that we use to try to control our experience and our existence. One thing is never showing too much of yourself, for example, never being vulnerable in a crowd of people. This is something that can be learned by people, something that can be held true to. This is something that I personally held on to for years. The idea that you never should be vulnerable to the people around you. Because if you do, they will use that opportunity to destroy you. They will use that information to destroy you. So you take that, and then you bring that as a Christian to the gospel. What does Jesus say to do? What does God bring us to places to do?
Be vulnerable.
Be vulnerable. Be open. Be blameless. And that ends up being the big one. If you're blameless, then what do you have to fear in being vulnerable?
Mm-hmm.
If you're forgiven for your sins, what do you need to protect and hide?
Yep.
Yeah, it's a weird feeling, like telling everything out, like anything that you've ever had secret. I've experienced this,
Mhm.
and it is a weird feeling, like you feel kind of weightless about it afterwards, but
I
Yeah.
thought about that before, like if Mary Magdalene, was embarrassed about telling how she had Jesus cast 7 demons out of her or something. I mean, other people today wouldn't say that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm almost done.
And it's kind of one of those things where I always think of people that, like what you're saying, being blameless. Like everybody's like, oh, what if my security information was breached and people were able to see my internet stuff? It's like, don't do stuff on the internet that you wouldn't want people to see.
Or just tell everybody that you've got stuff on the internet that they shouldn't see.
Then
It's just
also
like,
sometimes
It is a lack of honesty.
what were we going to say?
sometimes it also like if you too honest,
Or if you really
like scare
something
people
innocuous, but it's
away
embarrassing.
too.
It's fine.
Like,
That's the point here, though. Is like we have all these little things
yeah.
that we utilize, this wisdom that we utilize to try, that can actually become a means of separating ourselves from God. And even if they sound good in this world, we're not called to be part of this world in that sense. We're called to be something else. We illustrate a new culture, one that is beholden to God. We are under the reign of heaven. We are in the reign of God. So shouldn't we live like that? Or should we live like those in the world who are afraid? And if we're honest about it, sometimes we have to answer that question with a yes. We feel that way. Because that's how we feel. Whether that's right or wrong, that's how we feel. And there's a place for us to be honest about that. And you know what else is that there's a place for us to allow God to call us out of that. To actually challenge us to step forward and be like, oh, share that information with this person. See what they do. See if they reject you. And then watch them not. And then suddenly that whole mentality has to be challenged because now God's challenging you with the reality that He's created for you, as opposed to the reality that you've been afraid of or experienced in the past. Because there's a portion of it where in all of this, what we're talking about, and about the honesty side of it, is that there's a place for God to call us into real healing and real change that's permanent.
I guess there was in the past more of a mentality that, like, in polite society, you don't talk about religion or politics or things with just anybody. You know?
Yeah, in the past?
Yeah,
What do you mean in the past?
like before, like radio.
No, dude, that's
I don't remember that.
That's
For
still
radio.
It doesn't
a
matter.
thing.
Oh, okay.
So, in all of this, the stuff that Paul was calling forward here was to bring people, was to create an opportunity for people to meet God. That's why he came and gave messages from God, and why he leaned on the Spirit's power. And the Corinthian church didn't respond to every single thing well. Because the truth of the matter is that there are places where people will not respond to God well. There are places where we need to be honest about the fact that we do not respond to God well. Whether we want to or not, and also to understand that we're not going to be rejected or abandoned because we don't appreciate the things that God's calling us into, or the things that God's asking of us for. And to understand that a portion of why he's calling us into those things is because he has something far grander in mind than what we do. Because again, going back to the beginning, we're just grabbing for whatever feels good and running from whatever feels bad.
Yeah. There's a quote that's like, you'll find what you need most in the place you least want to look for it.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a passage, I believe it's in Philippians, where Paul references how there are people who worship their stomachs.
Yep.
And how he makes that point because it's the way that they thirst and function in a lifestyle that's going after whatever they crave.
Like a glutton.
Might be Colossians. I'm pretty sure it's Philippians, though.
It sounds like Romans.
Like a glutton?
I think it's at the end of Romans, or like 1st or 2nd Timothy, where he's saying certain false teachers, like their God is their belly and all that.
Yeah, we'll look it up in a moment. But the point is like, it is something that's addressed, and the way that people will go after cravings. So do we worship the cravings, or do we worship God? Do we follow our stomachs, or do we follow Jesus?
Sounds like an eating disorder.
Right?
It's far worse.
And that's the thing of it. And there's also a place for us to be honest about which one of those we do. Philippians
3:19.
3:19. Thank you.
Well, I was thinking of Romans 16:18.
Okay. So, therein lies that thing. In this place where Paul brought this forward, the idea of knowing God and bringing God closer, and that secret wisdom of God about just what he's doing and the way that we don't really receive that unless we're with him. This is something that we'll talk about here further, but it's something that we need to receive by being in those places, by being willing, by being open. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it sucks. There's a place where we also need to understand that those feelings are temporary. And they don't always stay the same.
Nope.
Because the
Feelings never
reality,
do.
because the reality of it is, even as little kids, so using that analogy, little kids wanting candy instead of vegetables, how many people grew up to like vegetables? Yeah, oh, everybody.
But I
Everybody
still
in the
like
room.
candy too.
Yes, candy is
I
fantastic.
should stick to vegetables.
But it's good after the vegetables. And that's the thing.
And even as adults, we don't.
Sugar is the devil, though.
I can eat my
No,
candy
it's really
first and then the vegetables.
Right.
That
It's
is
like what
one.
Charles Barkley says, if it tastes good, spit it out.
What?
That's what Charles Barkley said, that's how he lost weight, he said.
Stop it, Aaron.
Uh,
You're speaking heresy.
That's an eating disorder too.
Yeah. But the point is like, in this, is see, we grow up and we change. And at the end of the day, we grow up when we're faced with God and when we're close to Him. And as we develop alongside with Him, we move into places of maturity. And that's where we can find that wisdom and really live in that. But it's also places where we can come to change in such a way where we can even appreciate and really enjoy the things that that nurture us, that build us, the things that God's doing as we learn who He is, why He's doing what He's doing, as we develop in that. And we can do that honestly instead of trying to believe we do or trying to pretend we believe we do.
Was this the first you were
And that's all I
thinking
got.
of?